launch new cuisine entrepreneurs. And so this space will be filled with those kind of practices as time goes on. So please, given their generous support of us, support them by taking a beverage, and I believe they also have some food that you can choose. We hope to be live streaming tonight. We're good, all right. And so actually, we'll post a link to the resulting recording after this so that you can refer to it later if you'd like. Now, we'll also have Q&A. We'll have the microphone. I'll pass it around. Please use this so that those online will hear what you say. If you're online, please send your questions to through the chat section of the video, and our videographer, Sam, will get them to the speaker. Tonight, we're pleased to raise a pint with Katharyne Mitchell, who's the Dean of Social Sciences and a Professor of Sociology at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research explores migration, and recent books include Making Mordecai's, The Radical Geographies of Education, and the Handbook on Critical Geographies of Migration. She is the recipient of grants from the MacArthur Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and she received a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 2015. Please welcome Professor Mitchell.
There we go. It sounds a little loud. Is it okay? A little loud? David, is this, or is this okay? Okay. And please wave your arms in distress if it goes wrong. And if anybody wants to move closer, it's an intimate gathering, so please feel free. So thank you to David and to Mike for inviting me, and to Forager for hosting us here. The talk today is going to be based on some of my research from the Guggenheim in 2016 on sanctuary, the role of faith-based organizations in providing refuge to migrants. So what I'm going to do is begin the talk with an image of the Pope in Ciudad Juarez, where he made the sign of the cross, stood silently for a moment, and then looked out across the US-Mexico border and waved at people in El Paso, Texas. You can see in the background an Immigrant Lives Matter sign on a building, as well as all of the people lined up in the border fencing. And this followed what he had said earlier that year at the Vatican, as the migrant movement into Europe began to accelerate over the long summer of 2015. May every parish, every religious community, every monastery, every sanctuary of Europe take in one family, he said. And the Vatican did take in a family, a Syrian family of 4 from Damascus, who they housed at the Santa Ana parish. So it's not just symbolic help that's offered here, but concrete material efforts, humanitarian aid. So these statements and my ongoing work on philanthropy made me think about the many different kinds of humanitarian interventions and what's at stake in intervening or not intervening in various kinds of social problems. More broadly, what are some of the ramifications we can think of these interventions? What can we learn from them? And first, it's important to know that in this era, the role of non-government and not-for-profit philanthropic humanitarian organizations are growing in importance. As nations have reduced humanitarian aid and the amounts are insufficient because of greater need, there are more so-called 3P public-private partnerships in humanitarian aid. And in migration-related forms of aid, faith-based actors are key actors in this larger structure of humanitarian aid. And they're important really in 2 ways. They tend to be there for the long haul rather than in moments of crisis, so they are staying, not just coming in and leaving after a particular moment. And they're also critical because of the impact that some of these faith-based organizations have on policy. And that's one of the specific things I'm going to focus on today. So the research project that I'm working on now is an investigation of the sanctuary practices in particular of churches, particularly those that are actively protecting asylum claimants at risk of deportation, through giving them sanctuary in a church, and that is illegal. So they are acting against the law to provide literal physical refuge, concrete material aid to these bodies, these people who are at risk of deportation. Today what I want to do is focus on how the churches are working together across national borders to provide assistance to these types of, and I'm going to call them refugees, even though what they are technically is migrants who have been denied asylum, or they're waiting for their claims to be processed in this sort of interminable place and time. And sometimes they've been denied asylum on what's called Dublin regulations rules. So what that is in Europe is if you enter in Italy or Greece, you're coming in through the water, which is very common, and then you make your way to Germany or Sweden, you can be deported from those latter countries back to the first country of entry, and that's under the Dublin regulations. So a lot of the people I was looking at in Germany and Northern Europe were at risk of deportation back to the first country of origin. But I did a lot of research in Greece in 2016, and the conditions also in Hungary are horrific in those camps, and people's waiting years and years for their claims to be processed. So it isn't like they're being deported back to a safe space, which is the language of the EU. They're being deported back to really horrible situations. So my field work at this time was in Berlin. I did 4 months of field work, but what I'm going to draw on mainly in this talk today is from research in Germany. So overall, I spent 2 months in Geneva, 2 weeks in Berlin, 2 weeks in Brussels, and 2 weeks in Athens and on Lesbos. Did interviews with nonprofits and policymakers, with faith-based actors, activists, and migrants, over 50 interviews in all. And I also attended a bunch of conferences, and this is one of those conferences I'm showing you here in Berlin in 2016, organized by the German Ecumenical Committee on Church Asylum, or Decca. So Decca is actually one of the oldest church asylum networks in Europe. And at this 2-day meeting, several nonprofits and activists were invited, as well as congregants, priests, friends of the church, etc. So at these kinds of conferences, what you see are talks on the main floor of the church, but also lots of breakout sessions, which you can see here. And it's where people come together in smaller groups to discuss migration and what their different areas of the world, or their different areas of the PPP, public-private partnership, what they're doing. They get informed about the specifics of various kinds of cases worldwide. And it's people from churches, faith-based activist organizations, and secular organizations from all over Europe that came together to this conference to share data and resources. This one, just to give you an example of another conference I attended in Vienna, is the Eurodaya Konya network. Diakonia is a church network that's faith-based actors that works on behalf of the vulnerable and marginalized globally. It's a transnational network of Christian churches, but it's also allied with secular actors. Eurodaya Konya is the European part of that worldwide network, and the meeting that they were holding here was about migration, particularly how the church network itself could help its member churches in their work with migrants, and how it should advocate with the EU as a representative on behalf of migrants. Again, like the other conference I just showed you, there's a lot of participation and consensus. It's focused on sharing information and deliberation. And here, as with the other place, people are invited from all over Europe to talk about what's happening in their particular country. In this one, there were over 10 different countries that I counted. The language is often in English, fortunately for me. And participation is in these sort of active consensus group discussions. And what I want to show you here is, again, getting back to that idea of concrete material change. If you look at the middle of this flyer that was circulated there, achieving change, it's very obviously a practical central goal is very pragmatic. What can we do to make the situation better? And what you can't see on this flyer, but is just below it, is where it identifies the specific EU institutions that are lobbied by this transnational church network. So they include the European Commission, European Parliament, European Economic and Social Committee, European Council, et cetera. And I interviewed a lot of people in those organizations when I was in Brussels, and they talked about the importance of the church representatives, faith-based actors who came often once a week. They had to have a standing meeting to lobby on behalf of migrants in all kinds of different areas, from multicultural sort of policy to advocating for more affordable housing. So what's going on? Why is there this attention on refugees and migration among these Christian activist networks in this time period? So as you probably know, today there's an unprecedented 65.6 million people around the world that have been forced from home. Among them are nearly 22.5 million refugees, over half of whom are under the age of 18. Now, what this slide shows you is the asylum applications particular to the EU. And this data is from Eurostat in between 2005 and 2015. So it shows you a decade of change. And I want to point you to the upswing in the last 3 to 4 years. You can see the increase in applications for asylum, particularly from non-EU member states. And this is where they're going. On the left, you can see, again, a Eurostat graph in the thousands showing where asylum seekers are headed. It's primarily to Germany, and then next down, Hungary, Sweden, Austria, Italy, et cetera. And what I wanted to show you, why I brought this up from this era, is because many of these countries, as you probably are aware, have adopted increasingly hardline policies on asylum seekers over the last 3 to 4 years, partly in response to the populist use of immigration as a political football by authoritarian leaders in these countries. So there's been a rapid increase in desperate people trying to gain asylum in these countries, and at the same time you're starting to see a strong shift similar to this country against immigrants. So this is an example of some of the growing anti-immigrant sentiment in the 2016 in several countries. PEGIDA stands for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamicization of the West. This movement was founded in Dresden in 2014 as an explicitly anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim group, and it's been growing rapidly since then. So this march that you can see in the lower left took place in February 2016, and it was just over a year after PEGIDA was founded, and it was the beginning of PEGIDA marches all across Europe in 2016, and showing some of the strong rise of neo-Nazi movement in Germany and elsewhere in Europe over the last 2 to 3 years. So this is the context in which sanctuary is taking off in Europe, especially Germany. But where does the practice of giving sanctuary come from? So the idea of sanctuary was originally as a sacred place, even going back to the ancient Greeks. It's from the Latin sanctuarium. Arium is a container for keeping something in, and sancta is something holy, or someone holy. And churches in Europe, as you probably know, were built on places that were considered to be holy because of the belief that a miracle happened on that space. And the actual spot where the church is built is considered sanctified, and the altar area is considered particularly sacred. Now, the idea that criminals, or those accused of any kind of crime, could be offered sanctuary in churches or given protection from arrest comes from the medieval period, from 600 AD, and it was in operation for over 1,000 years in Europe. And it was recognized in English law during that time, actually all the way up to the 17th century, in some cases places up to the 18th century. And with the rise of the Enlightenment, it was abolished or greatly reduced because there was a sense that it was impeding good governance or the rational thought. But ending the practice, which was hailed as progress in some areas in the early modern period, especially by reformers who believed in the rule of law, and this is outside of the law, some 19th century thinkers actually are looking back, or were looking back nostalgically at that period of sanctuary as actually a time of alternative justice where escape from people chasing people often caught up in blood feuds of various kinds was a form of justice. So because there were so many innocent people caught up in or falsely accused in the medieval period, many people after the rational Enlightenment periods really took off, looked back at this time and saying, actually, a lot of innocent people were saved because of this alternative sense of justice that was encapsulated in sanctuary. So I'm going to skip ahead now to the 1980s. First, I should point out, as I'm sure everybody knows, church sanctuary is no longer legal. But the collective memory and the tradition still holds. And this is one of the things that's interesting to me as a geographer. I'm a sociology professor now, but I was trained as a geographer. And I'm interested in the ways that the spaces of the church and of these networks, and the memories that are lodged in those spaces of sancta and of alternative justice still have sway, and how they can be important in terms of affecting policy. Because as you probably know, the forces of the law do not like to go into the churches and remove someone. Because for many reasons, but one of them is it's really bad press. And I'm going to talk about that too, and how the churches use that. Okay, so skipping ahead to, the 1980s. The sanctuary movement in the US offered protection to asylum seekers from Central America, particularly from Guatemala and Honduras, and El Salvador, who were denied refugee status because of the Cold War in the 1980s. So Ronald Reagan was in alliance with a lot of the right-wing dictatorships in those countries, and as a result, anybody fleeing those dictatorships was not accorded to be given refugee status, and so they were not given asylum. So churches, starting in Tucson, but then taking off in many cities around the US, began to shield and protect these people because they could see that they were, if they were going to be deported, they were going back to certain death. And some of these church leaders, such as John Fife, I'm going to return to, have become involved in the European sanctuary movement today. And that's one of the things that interests me, is this sort of network of people. Oh, sorry, one more. There's also, as everyone knows, a contemporary movement in the US called the New Sanctuary Movement, which is very active in some cities. And there are these sanctuary cities which have come under increasing notice and attack from President Trump and many Republican politicians since the November election of 2016. Okay, so let's look at sanctuary in Europe. There's now active sanctuary movements in several countries and important church networks behind the practice. So sanctuary practices range from sort of basic hospitality and advocacy and refugee assistance to the actual protection of a human being in a church. And that's what I'm looking at, that type of sanctuary, that's where the person is actually protected physically. Some of these important networks include the Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe, or CCME you see there, and Decca, the German Ecumenical Committee on Church Asylum. And that last one focuses a lot of its specific energies on that physical protection of people in their church networks. So just quickly to show you how widespread this kind of general protection of migrants is within churches in Europe, this is a response to a survey that was sent out. I know you can't see the details, but I want you to look at the bottom bars on these three bars. Those are the yes answers. And you can see, if you look at the yes answers, the blue, that about 40%, or 2 out of every 5 churches at the national level in Europe, offer some form of assistance to migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers. Now, that's not all sanctuary practices in the church, but that's some form of assistance. So that's really quite a lot of people. And this is figures from Decca showing the actual people who are protected in the churches physically in 2016. And I just wanted to show you that there were 292 church asylums for 463 people in 2016, and recent data showed that increased quite a bit to 547 people in 2017, of whom 145 are children. And although these numbers are relatively small, what I want to point out is that they're symbolically incredibly important. because they get a lot of press coverage, partly because the churches are so good at using that sense of collective memory and alternative justice, and then with their media savvy, they make sure people realize how many people are actually being protected in churches, and it gives a kind of attention to the wider issue of migrants and asylum claimants in Europe. So this is just an example from May 2016. 400 asylum claimants were given temporary refuge in St. Catholic's Catholic Church by the priest. And what I want to point out here is that this story is in English, so this has made it international news. So Sanctuary became a really big story in Europe. It's not just a big story in the United States, and it has similar heated discussions in Europe. And I was, be in many conferences where even people in the church were very heated in their differences about how far to go to break the law or not, how far you go to protect someone or not. This is an example of a forced removal, and again, getting the national press. It was in Munster in August 2016, and again, these types of stories are picked up from the local news, and then they're amplified by church networks such as Decca, which work directly with journalists to make sure these events are covered. This is a forced removal where it was videoed, and these are two Iraqi teenagers, probably 16 years old, taken out of a church in Iceland. The video was put up on YouTube, and I was able to interview the pastor right after this removal, and she told me, this is part of what we said in the interview. We formed a circle around the altar. The police came and took the men. The police were in plain clothes and in police gear. We told them, we are here. This is a peaceful demonstration, but they were dragged out of the church. And why I put that on here is because I was in Geneva. I interviewed in Geneva. She actually left Iceland. She left her post, and she was so affected by having this happen in her church that I would say she went from being quite a sort of law-abiding, if you will, person. And the church in Iceland, Lutheran church, is very close to the state. They get a lot of their money from the state. And she thought that was just a fine relationship until this happened. And then she kind of became radicalized by this moment in the sense of, we really need to do something. We're too close with the state, and this is not acceptable. So what I wanted to do here is to provide this overarching context of the growing importance of faith-based institutions and actors in these new public-private partnerships and the rise of sanctuary practice in Europe and worldwide, plus the growing number of churches willing to participate in various kinds of civil disobedience around this issue, and finally the tenseness that I can't really capture it here, but it's extremely tense around these questions of migrant and refugee protection at the same time that these increasingly hard lines are being drawn in the sand, and you have these very vociferous right-wing anti-immigrant groups rising. So you can see, very much like here, these tensions are really growing. So given this context, what are some of the research questions you can ask? What are the things that the questions I wanted to pose with this material? One of these is thinking about alternative ideas about justice and how those ideas can move, how they move, particularly across national borders. That is something that really interests me. So that protected sites of political sanctuary can be formed for people. So as I said before, I'm trained as a geographer, but if you think about how policy moves, for example, as a political scientist, what they would tend to do is to focus on the idea of transfer. So they'd say, okay, this policy of, say, zero tolerance or of laissez-faire economic policy, right? This policy goes from point A to point B through this narrow set of rational actors, and then they model it from above. It's kind of disembodied and abstracted from actual people and places. But what geographers want to do, I think, is we're interested in how policies move. So how they're mobile and what happens in the process of their being mobile. And also looking at how those policies are transformed and mutated through that process of moving through literal time and space along through the bodies of people talking with each other in these kinds of conferences and meetings. So history and geography, and as I said before, like literally, I'm interested in the stones of the church, like the ways that memory can be lodged and held in space, in the buildings of certain kinds of spaces, and how those can create political possibilities of action that people can reinvigorate or reactivate at different moments when it's needed. So you can have a long time period where there's nothing happening and the building is there, but I'm interested in the way the memory is held in those spaces, and then people can activate them as needed, and that becomes a site at which the network it's a node in a network. So this also takes in, of course, the importance of actors. Who is advocating and persuading about these kinds of policy? Who is attempting to mold the policies? Who's actually making a difference through their connections? And there's a lot of scholarship, as you can imagine, on this, like there is on everything, and I'm not going to bore you with that. But I think for me, the study of church networks, especially those actors who are resistant to normative ways of thinking and are producing sort of counter-hegemonic practices and ideas that are moving across national borders, as we were showing, these can be, that's, I think, really important. And these can be actors with deep ideas about morality or ethics that aren't necessarily bound by normative conventions of, example of liberalism or the rule of law or systems of justice that are based on a nation state or in the past on the sovereign, like the king. The abstract, the alternative justice of the medieval church spaces were going against the sovereign, the monarch, and now those spaces are being activated against the sovereign nation state. So let me give you a couple empirical examples from my work. So this is John Fife, the Presbyterian pastor involved in the U.S. sanctuary movement in Tucson in the 80s. So he was invited by Decca, the German Ecumenical Society, to a new sanctuary movement conference in Berlin in 2010 to speak about his experiences in the U.S. And he had a direct influence on this man, Pastor Wolf-Dieter Just, who I also interviewed when I was there in 2016. So when he came, he was the first speaker at this major conference called the New Sanctuary Movement. He gave a speech where he invoked the model of their 1980s movement in Tucson, which was the abolition movement in the US in the 19th century, particularly the Underground Railroad. So after the US Border Patrol ordered Fife and the other churches to stop giving sanctuary to Central American refugees in 1981, or said they'd be indicted and taken to prison, he told the people in Berlin the following decision that their group made. He said they defined it thus: we can take our stand with the oppressed, or we can take our stand with organized oppression. We can serve the kingdom, or we can serve the kingdoms of the world, but we cannot do both. Maybe, as the gospel suggests, this choice is perennial and basic. But the presence of undocumented refugees here among us makes the definitive nature of our choice particularly clear and concrete. When the government itself sponsors the crucifixion of entire peoples and then makes it a felony to shelter those seeking refuge, a law-abiding protest merely trains us to live with atrocity. So what's interesting to me here is the pretty direct invocation to break the law and to draw inspiration from what he would say is a higher law, the willingness to operate outside of normative conventions of the nation state, of national systems of law. And in this flyer from the conference, that's this same conference, 2010, the Sanctuary Movement in Berlin, you can see all of the many actors here that were participating in this conference. It was a huge conference, a very tangible meeting up of church network participants organized by Decca and CCME, but coming together from all over Europe with both secular and other non-secular actors. So by the end of this meeting, this group was met for 3 days, and they started with John Fife. They came together, what are we doing? What is the New Sanctuary Movement? What is sanctuary for us? What did they come up with as their sanctuary movement charta? And I'm going to let you read their charta. Okay? What do you notice? It's very much in the spirit of what John Fife had started the conference with. So this faith-based network that also pulled in secular actors and organizations across both time and space to pass along ideas and values that go against the norms of society as codified in law, including the EU laws and regulations. Now here's a page from another network organization by Decca in 2016, which is another sanctuary movement. And many of the same actors, you probably can't read it, it's in German, continue to meet and work together, but there are also many new actors involved. And it's just a couple things I want to call your attention to before I finish up. Okay, so the theme of this 2016 conference in Berlin was Beyond Europe, and then a German, translated as Do We Protect Borders or Human Rights? The title of the conference, Beyond Europe, itself represents a direct challenge to the EU and to member state norms of territory and sovereign rights to help determine how to manage migrants. They're saying, no, you don't get that. We're going beyond Europe. And I also want to point out the use of both German and English here in the title. This is a direct effort in this is the flyer from the workshop to reach beyond the local. And the speakers at the workshop represented a mixed group of politicians from BAMF, which is the German government ministry involved with migration, with refugee management secular activist groups like Pro-Asyl, Amnesty International, with liberal NGOs like Sea-Watch, alongside many faith-based organizations. So they're all there on the flyer. So this is indeed the public-private partnership of contemporary governance, but these networks are involved in alternative ideas about humanitarian justice and acting on them. So this is the final slide. I'm sure you're relieved to know. And what I want to just point out here is that while a lot of migration scholarship now emphasizes the dramatic contemporary increase in state violence and exclusionary policies that are directed at migrants, it's only really been in recent years that scholarship is focusing on the alliances and networks that are bringing these kinds of diverse groups together in acts of resistance. Many of these faith-related networks working with and on behalf of refugees attempt to influence migration policy by writing policy briefs, press releases, reports, papers, meetings with EU officials as often as possible. And in addition to constant lobbying of EU bureaucrats, ministers, politicians, and policymakers at the local scale, both CCME and Decca, for example, work closely with academics. Now, this particular image here is from an academic report called Mapping Migration, Mapping Churches' Responses in Europe, and it provided important contemporary demographic data on migration, along with a lot of specific information about how churches were responding in different countries. And this is just one of hundreds of academic reports, papers, and policy briefs that have been churned out. These types of documents and alliances manifest the importance of this polyglot network of actors who are often held together by their faith, a strong belief in what they're doing, and the possibilities of making a difference through their actions. So in this talk, I examined how ideas and policies travel across space and across time. My particular interest was in the question of how resistance to normative programs of governance in migration can be transnationally engaged and sustained in the memories of past events and in the layering of those events in particular places. Many of the relationships and connections that were formed through sanctuary conferences in specific churches and specific neighborhoods influenced the creation of broader forms of solidarity. They also affected policy decisions with government actors in the EU and connections that live on in mission statements, websites, reports, charters, and people. Such solidarities take place not only across space, but also across time. Critical for these sanctuary networks are the temporal connections between the past and the present, from the medieval understandings of alternative justice to the Underground Railroad, to the sanctuary movements of the 1980s, early 2000s, and the contemporary period. Such histories of struggle are often made concrete within the spaces of the church itself, where they become the sparks that are brought to bear on the present moment, permeating these networks with the electricity of hope. Thank you.
So, Professor Mitchell is going to take a few questions, and I will pass around this microphone without feedback when that happens. A little bit more. Oh, that's all right. I think we've, did you turn that up? Yeah, hello. Hello. Okay, I think we have it.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Germany, why? Geography or guilt over World War II?
How's that? Is that okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think there's a strong Lutheran tradition, and that's one of the main networks that has been very effective for a long period of time, especially across borders. And the neighborhood where one of the main churches, where both these conferences were held, is a very poor immigrant neighborhood. So the pastors are, they live it. They live this world, and then they have a lot of connections with other people who are also interested. I think history might have made a difference too, to be honest. I mean, the people would say, how can we, of all places, not see the kinds of things that are happening to the migrants here? And I think you probably know Merkel is a daughter of a pastor, so she was one of the people who said, we're taking refugees, we just are. With our history, we can't do otherwise.
Is that right? Okay. Thank you for the talk. That was really fascinating, the idea of memory being lodged in the churches and how it reactivates is kind of something I'm going to be thinking about for a while. So my question, it comes from an oversimplified idea of the history of like charity and the role of nonprofits in kind of enacting change at the level of policy or not historically.
Humanitarian organizations, you're saying? Or,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So, and I think counted among those are kind of faith-based organizations. So maybe in historical periods where there was not such a contentious relationship between the state and kind of the church, I suppose.
Yeah.
It seems as if the role of nonprofits, or the effect of kind of nonprofit humanitarian work, has been to relieve government of addressing kind of systematic problems that produce things like refugee crises.
Yes.
And so this seems like a little bit of a different moment, and I wondered if you could kind of talk about what might be, I don't know, the kind of defining markers of perhaps faith-based, the capacity for faith-based organizations to enact policy change. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question. The question is really looking at how a lot of charities through time are reformist in orientation, and so they don't actually attack or deal with structures of power that enabled, that led to these kinds of problems in the first place, right? And so is this a different moment where you can see faith-based actors involved in these various kinds of networks with secular actors? Could we see something different with this? And of course, there's also very many conservative faith-based actors, as we know, worldwide and in the United States. So I'm looking at one particular strand of people who are already maybe thinking a little bit alternative, or outside the government always knows best box, or the capitalism always knows best box. We need to think of how we can help people in different kinds of ways that isn't just a sort of Enlightenment, liberal, rational 18th century way of thinking. And that's interesting to me too. It's like you're drawing on different rationalities of governance, right? And this has always been the case, but they tend to get written out of history. We tend to think that the history is a linear teleological progress, a story of progress to the perfect, where everybody will be included and everybody will be fed. And what this is saying is that that's not necessary. This is a sort of different strand of thought that's outside of that, and saying sometimes we need to have, that isn't going to happen, and we need to think differently about how to engage with the world. And it's more of a sort of, it's a pastoral, it's not liberal. It's outside of these national systems of ways of thinking. It's hard for us who've been steeped in this, or most of us, I think, steeped in a certain way of thinking about how you engage with the world and how you make things better. And some people I had a really great interview with somebody that really it was very eye-opening to me. And she was an activist in a church, and she said, I work with it, because I said, don't you have to answer to donors and funders? You have to operate within, you're helping this many people in this amount of time. That's what philanthropy is now, right? It's you can't just be like, I'm giving my time. You're like, if you're getting funded, you have to be accountable. And I said, you're operating within that kind of liberal system of governance. And she said, yes. She said, that's one way of thinking about time that I operate in. And then she said, and I also operate in God's time. And she said, that understanding that I have that time also allows me to work in this other time. It was really interesting, because she said, this is what gives me sustenance through the bad periods. I'm in she called it, there's a German word that means kind of like cradle or being held up. She said, I operate in this time where I'm being held up in my knowledge that the world, that God is protecting this space, and I'm going to do whatever I can in the world, but then there's also this other world. I'm not a person of faith myself, so it's hard. I really had to. It's hard, but it's like for me. It's not hard for people who believe, but I found very compelling to think that it was a different kind of way of being a humanitarian interventionist. And that space that she talked about, God's time, also compelled her to stay after the crisis was over. So UNHCR comes in when there's a crisis, right? They come in and they do what they can. Like this, Syrians are coming into Hungary, or where, and they go to Hungary and they do what they can. And it's not over. There's no moment when it's over. And often the faith-based actors, I talked about churches, but there's other faith-based actors involved in these kinds of things. They stay. They're the ones who deal with the people on the ground. Their children have to go to school. It's a lot longer than UNHCR and the other sort of liberal nonprofit or governmental organizations are in there for. The Gates Foundation, they want that magic bullet. They want to see change. Because I also look at health and education things. Those kinds of philanthropies, they're very vertical and siloed. Like, okay, we're going to fix this with malaria, this kind of or antiretroviral, and then we want it to be done in 5 years, and then we're out and move to the next thing. But it's like that things. If you're dying, if you're starving to death, it doesn't matter if your disease is cured. So it's this sort of, I guess I'm trying to see it geographical. It's horizontal. Like what these aid organizations do is horizontal rather than vertical. And you often see these kinds of, from the West or anywhere come in and they come down, they want that thing to be fixed because there's a certain amount of money on it and it has to be leveraged and it has to be in a certain amount of time and it's all of this. And then you need the God's time, according to this woman, to keep you through the longer horizontal period of a human life. Sorry, it was a long-winded answer to your question because it brought up a lot of interesting things that I've found. Just like a what? I'm here as a random person. Oh, no, it's.
Today I was reading about an analysis of Manchester City soccer and the ability for them to be able to create space, which then afforded the time that they can make decisions which have greater chances on goal.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. One of my grad students in Argentina, she's from Argentina and she did her dissertation on these spaces in Argentina that were kind of a popular, there's a word for it, but I don't speak Spanish, but spaces where people came when the dictatorships were disappearing people and they needed to have a place where they could come and talk and figure out what to do. And those spaces form the same kind of function as the church spaces. And her dissertation was how that moment era ended, but then they've had similar issues in 2002 and 2000 with the peso devaluation and other kinds of problems where people would reactivate those assemblies spaces in Buenos Aires in a similar kind of way to what I'm talking about in the churches. So I think you can see those kinds of, the creation of those kinds of secular sanctuaries, if we want to call it that.
Collective belief.
Yeah, but the building has to stay. I mean, I don't know if any of you guys like Art Deco architecture. I love it. So Victor Horta is one of the most famous Art Nouveau sort of architects. And in Brussels, one of the most beautiful buildings ever built was a working man's building, for the common people, for workers, and they tore it down. One of the most beautiful buildings in the world, because they don't want that kind of space for people to remember those moments and be able to congregate in a sense of alternative or resistance to the normative ways of thinking about how society should operate, which is capitalist, free market, the nation state. So whatever you think about those kinds of systems, it's important to realize that there aren't that many resistant spaces where people can come together outside of those kinds of ways of being in the world.
Katharyne, if I could ask you to move into the light for the sake of our online, and then I'm going to steal for a question myself here. I have extensive background in Scandinavia. I visit Norway every summer, and I live there.
Hear you, David.
I lived in Norway for 8 years, and I'm there every summer. One of the things about Scandinavia is the decline in the role of the church.
Decline in what?
In the role of the church. Relatively few people attend. On the other hand, they remain a very moralistic society. Drives me crazy. But what I'm wondering is if for example, in Sweden, with its huge rise in migrants, if there is a change in the relationship between the non-religious, the less church-devoted, to the church in these Scandinavian countries, has this changed the relationship of church to the rest of society?
Well, one of the things that's very interesting about Europe is, as you point out, it's become much more secular than the United States in terms of church going, okay? And people actually will say they're religious. That doesn't mean that the cultural traditions of the church are any less important to people. And that's the thing that people are drawing on. Both secular and non-secular actors are drawing on those cultural traditions and memories in some ways more, although people like John Fife are also drawing on what they think of as a higher law, like there's somebody that they don't want to not be good people because their morality is based on their sense of God and their religion, their faith. But a lot of people that would be involved in these kinds of situations are not acting on that so much as acting on the sense that, how dare you go into our churches and take people out against the sort of memory of those spaces and against the traditions of those spaces and the meaning that is meaningful for people. That these spaces, even if they don't go to church anymore. Does that answer your question at all?
Hi. I can go ahead. Yeah, okay. So my question is, thank you for your very insightful talk, first of all. My question is, for example, if an asylum seeker gets an asylum, right?
Sorry, it's just there's a lot of, you can just come closer. And
Okay, so for example, if an asylum seeker gets an asylum, is there any built-in system after that to support them? For example, if I give example from United States, like someone has to navigate the credit score system or getting the driving license from DMV, there is a lot of new things to navigate in their new countries. Is there any support system built for that in that system?
The question, is there any way we can support asylum seekers?
Yeah, in this model, did you find anything that, is there anything built in that regard to support those people?
Anything we can do?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, it's really hard to hear.
So I think the question was, is there practical support for these migrants
From
as
here.
well as policy supports in Europe, correct?
Yeah, in Europe and
In Europe.
US. Yeah.
So practical,
Oh, yeah.
driver's licenses, getting into school, et cetera.
Sure, absolutely. And up through 2016, 2017, there was all kinds of government help, and there still is, more so than in this country now. And Merkel is, as I said, very much a supporter of people's right to claim asylum and be refugees. So there is absolutely all kinds of help for people. At the same time, there are a number of people who are being turned back, especially now in the last 2 years, and with the rise of a lot of right-wing governments. So the governments are supplying a lot of help. There's housing. There's, in some countries more than others. Germany's been particularly good. Hungary is not so good. Greece has become terrible. Sweden has not become. Scandinavia started to turn people away. I mean, it has gotten much worse in the last couple of years, and we just stopped hearing about it. You remember hearing a lot in 2015, 2016, and you don't hear about it anymore. It's not because people are not trying to still go. It's because they're getting stopped. The border has been externalized, so people are being stopped in Turkey. Like they have the EU agreement with Turkey to keep people there. They're being stopped in Libya. So they're not even, it's only the super desperate who even make it into the Mediterranean, and then they're often being left to drown. You can hear it, you see it frequently, that people are not getting picked up. Nobody will let the boat come to the shores. And this is the currently what's going on.
So I have a more kind of higher level question. So you spent a lot of time in Europe in your research here. The European Union is not a perfect union. They've got some challenges. One of their challenges is immigration, and immigration has been a problem and will probably continue to be a problem and maybe more of a problem in the future. So I'm just curious as to your perspective as to how your view is on whether the European Union stays together, from a perspective of the stress put on it from immigration.
Well, I don't see immigration as a problem. So that's my starting point. Migrants, this is a tiny fraction. So even 1 million people is a tiny fraction of the population. And they're coming to countries with a demographic profile where they desperately need workers at the bottom of the ladder. And they need people to take care of their aging population. So I find immigrants not a problem. I find them that they've given to society. Whether the EU stays together or not, I think probably has more to do with Brexit and what's going on in England, and the use of migration as a political football by populists. So we see the rise of Viktor Orban and other people like that because they're able to say, look, the problems are not economic neoliberal globalization, the problems are based on this group of people coming in and taking your jobs, which is absolutely false. But people are willing to believe it because they're lazy and they don't want to understand the more difficult complexities of how the social system's working, the economic system's working. So I guess I don't know if the EU is going to stay together or not, but I think it's not because it's a problem, but because people are using it and because of England being such a disaster right now.
So I guess a somewhat similar question, but within these churches as institutions, are the people that you met and spent time with, is this a polarizing issue within their churches, and is there a leadership crisis? Are they receiving blowback? Are there fights going on inside these churches where people want them to stop and then they have to stand up or even break off from their own church?
Yeah, this is not a smooth process. So a lot of the deliberations that I was showing you within the churches are, some people want to go much further than others in terms of breaking the law, in terms of advocating for people in ways that aren't just about providing food and sustenance, but actually challenging the system. And I had one conference where, so the EU declared at some point Afghanistan a safe space, so people could be deported to certain parts of Afghanistan. And people in the church said that's not a safe space, and other people were saying, well, they must know if it's a safe space or not. So these kinds of tensions are playing out all the time between people. And again, everybody feels like they're a good person and they want to do the right thing, but where you will put your body on the line or not, or where you want to find your space is different from everybody in terms of what you're going to do. So yes, a lot of tension.
Hi, thank you very much. I noticed on the slide you had much earlier about destinations for refugees, and Germany was by far and away the top, but Hungary had a huge increase from one year to the next, from 2015 to 2016. Like looked like more than double. Yeah. What was any particular geographic reason for that?
It is geographical reason. So people are coming in, and it was the border was easiest to get to, and at the time it was it got closed, as you know. But at that time, it was the easiest way to people wanted to go through Hungary, and so that was the easiest way to do that.
All right, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mike. So you mentioned several times the Underground Railroad. Are these churches that you're talking about, in your metaphor of the physical space of the church, are they filling up? And if so, are people then being smuggled out of these churches to other churches upstream, if you will?
So it's an interesting question. So
Thank you.
in Germany, which is where I did most of my research, they had a law up through 2017 where they were working very closely with the state, with Banff. And if they were able to provide refuge for 6 months, the people had to be given, their cases had to be heard by the state actors. If they got caught under the Dublin regulations within that 6 months, they could be deported to Hungary, Greece, and Italy, which is where nobody wanted to go because especially, the situation was so bad. So the church would protect them for the 6 months, and the church had a kind of interesting, not really deal, but sort of like informal agreement that these people that they protected would do well when their cases came up, and they had a like 80% acceptance rate of those asylum claims for the people they protected for 6 months. A new government, a new Banff organization came in, the new ministry person came in, was much more, less willing to work with the churches. And so the woman I talked with, the head of Decca, she said that month after month, they were getting fewer and fewer acceptances of that in that relationship. So it was not working as well anymore.
Well, are there any more questions? Okay. Let's close this up. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight and for choosing us over the Sharks playoff game. So just like to thank Professor Mitchell. We have a token of our appreciation. Oh, I'll keep the paper. So thank you for coming all the way over here from the other side of the hill and joining us tonight. Yeah, fascinating, very important talk. So we do have a tradition here of mobbing the speaker after the talk. If you have a few minutes to stick around, if anybody would like to ask questions one-on-one. Okay, we'll make it one question. So to the Banana Slug alumni in the room, just a few words. I'd like to say there are a few things you can do if you're interested in helping out or volunteering. I think we've mentioned this before. We have a Alumni Association Scholarship Fund that you can donate to. We also have a lot of volunteer activities. You can go to alumni.ucsc.edu to sign up or to donate. Another thing you can do is you can join something called the UC Advocacy Network. This is our political arm of the University of California. It's a very simple way to get involved in state and national politics. If there are important legislative items that are coming up, you can very easily get involved. The goal is to have it take less than 2 minutes to tweet or write your local legislators, and we'll keep you informed of important legislation that's coming down. All you have to do to sign up is just text the number 52886. I'll wait. And you can also go to, you can Google UC Advocacy Network to sign up. It's very easy, and it really makes a tremendously big difference. Things are coming up with the UC budget. Things are coming up with relation to undocumented immigrants, for instance, which directly applies tonight. So I hope you'll sign up. Now, we hope you'll join us for our event next month. As usual, it's on the second Monday of the month. Our talk on June 10th, the title will be, and this is a question, the 1930s, the past of our present? Question mark. With Professor Mark Matera from the History Department. Again, that will be on June 10th, same time, same place, 6:30 right here. As Professor and Apite members, we have a special offer for you. Our partner organization, the Churchill Club, which has been doing a great job promoting for us, you've been offered $35 off the ticket price of their next event. Thursday evening's event in Santa Clara, their 21st annual Top 10 Tech Trends event. Use the code UCSCALUM35, that's all capitals, UCSCALUM35. You can talk to David after the talk if you have any questions. Now, get to know your neighbors, do a little bit of networking, get to know the people that talk next to you, and thanks for coming. Thanks for our live audience. Hi, Mom and Dad. We'll see you next month. Thank you.